All right, everybody. Hi, my name is Kelsey Bailey, and we are going to get started this morning, or I guess whenever you're watching it. This is the first time I'm doing a recording like this for an education, so happy to always receive feedback on that. But today we're going to cover nutrition for Decon. And again, my name is Kelsey Bailey. I'm a performance dietitian that works in the Denver, Colorado area and somewhat nationwide on police, fire, military, and women's health. So um, I got asked today to speak on nutrition for decon as it relates to some of this more massive smoke exposure that came from the LA fires. Um, but this could also be any wildfire season in California. So that's and other states that, potentially might be supported as well. So obviously there's a timely purpose for this particular presentation, but please know that this information kind of applies moving forward as well in your career. So I wanted to start off with how do we talk about exposures? How do we assess it? I think it's a word that gets tossed around a ton is exposures, exposures, exposures. What are my exposures? But kind of what are the buckets that we think of and why do we care about that? And the big study of all of that is called exposomics. And that's looking at what do we get exposed to in our physical environment, things like pollution, smoke exposure, pesticides, even what we might get exposed to at home within cleaning supplies or at the firehouse within cleaning supplies and detergents and stuff that we utilize there. Looking at our social environment and lifestyle. So, what does our diet and exercise patterns look like? What does sleep look like? Stress, smoking, alcohol use, all of those things would also be considered into that social environment. And then how does our body take all of those things, put them together, and respond to it? So, what does it look like with regard to DNA damage or DNA changes? What does that look like with protein signaling, your metabolism, cancer risk, cardiovascular disease risk, kind of some of those long-term exposures and putting that whole picture together. So that whole study of that interaction is called exposomics, but the study of the exposome, all those things we're getting exposed to. So what do we get exposed to specifically within wildfire? And what can we anticipate to see with that? It's kind of what we're going to go into next. So what is in wildfire smoke? I think probably a lot of you have heard many of these things, but we'll review them today regardless. So obviously we have some carbon monoxide. There are heavy metals present within wildfire smoke. Obviously we're getting some flame retardants that also might be carried within the smoke that we can inhale as well when fighting the fire. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or the PAHs, are more commonly talked about with that. We might see silica within the wildfire smoke. You more commonly see that in like our normal life in those little packets that sometimes come in like your multivitamins. Particulate matter, that's probably one you've heard talk about a lot, as it especially relates to like air purifiers and the size of the particulate matter. Not an area I'm going to dive into hugely today, but is a huge part of that wildfire smoke as well, and things like aldehyde. So quick overview of those, because mainly we care about what do these do in the body long term, and then how do we mitigate our risk for them longer, which we'll bridge into. So in looking at, I know it's kind of a busy slide, but we'll kind of go through it step by step here. Um, and this is looking at really when we are working within a smoky environment, fighting a wildfire, what happens to kind of some of the different processes within the body. So whether that be this particular study focused on the respiratory epithelium and respiratory system and vasculature surrounding that. So looking at getting exposed, what do we get breathing in from this? Who are the people who are most affected? Obviously, you guys are first line responders to this, so huge, huge exposure there. Thinking of things that can happen with that nervous system, so looking at heart rate and blood pressure, Our respiratory system is dealing with so many of the oxidative stressors that come in from breathing that in. And then the cardiovascular system, the vasculature surrounding the lungs also can get impacted by the inhalation of these different pollutants. Um, so this autonomic tone can again change that, especially if you have like an aura or a whoop, you might see changes in your HRV. And that has to do with kind of a drive into that sympathetic tone. Um, we see some damage to the respiratory epithelium that causes more inflammation within the lungs, increases oxidative stress within the lungs, and can affect obviously breathing. And then that particulate matter translocation that can kind of translate through this epithelium and into the vasculature as well. So these are things that happen when we're exercising, breathing, working within these wildfire environments. So how do we measure some of this exposure? I'll go into a little bit more of this later as well. Um, but really, like some of the more extreme side of the house, like looking at an ED visit, looking at hospitalization, restricted duty days, those things are easier to measure. It's some of those like tweener zones of, hey, I'm experiencing some shortness of breath or maybe some GI issues or whatever it might be, changes in that HRV, harder to measure on a large population. So we just don't have as much data on that as like some of the hospitalization or urgent care visits. Um, but looking at, again, I mentioned that particulate matter as well. There is more research being done on this space, especially when COVID happened. There was a lot of kind of joint research done on COVID and wildfire exposure, and then subsequent, lung function, asthma, cardiovascular health, all of that as well. So again, one that's kind of hard to measure on like a really large population level unless there's really severe things happening like hospitalization or emergency room visits. So making a long story short is sometimes it's kind of hard to measure since we're not doing a ton of blood work and urine work and lab work immediately after exposure in the firefighting community. In the firefighting community, your guys' world, your exposure specifically from that wildfire smoke is largely impacted in the immediacy by how long you were exposed, how long were you out, what did it look like to rotate out, what was the anticipated shift schedule, what was the real shift schedule, how is your gear fitting? Was there any, looseness in any of the gear? That could also be skin exposure, breathing exposure, kind of based off of gear fit. Um, kind of severity of other symptomologies can may be impacted by pre-existing conditions. So did we already have asthma? Do we already have cardiovascular disease or diabetes? Some of those things might get exacerbated by this wildfire exposure. And then other exposures in life, there's already known exposures, like PFAS, especially that the body has to deal with from the gear itself. We also have exposures that can happen just at home, and we'll go through some of those later as well. I mentioned there are heavy metals in smoke, and we'll go into a little bit more later of what do we actually do about this. But this particular study looked at the difference between smokers and non-smokers, as smokers have known heavy metal exposure from smoking itself. And the biggest difference between non-smokers and smokers when it was a wildfire exposure was the level of arsenic was way, way higher in the smokers, which made it a better discriminator of like, is this a wildfire smoke exposure or is this just smoke from smoking exposure, something that would be maybe more that you would also breathe in the environment walking around. But in the non-smokers, we saw lithium, cesium, nickel, cadmium, zinc, things like that increase as well. In a career length, things like mercury, lead, cadmium can show up in both smokers and non-smokers. So oftentimes heavy metals are tested via urine. They can be tested via blood as well. I have a little bit more info about that later in this presentation, but just wanted you to understand too that that's a part of that smoke and then again what the body, liver, gut has to deal with and trying to get rid of. Diseases that can be impacted by wildfire smoke exposure. Probably some of these aren't a huge surprise to most. Things like breathing issues, skin issues, eye issues, purely from smoke exposure, not grossly surprising. Acute respiratory, same thing. Blood pressure, same thing. Um, but some of the more interesting ones, things like anxiety, depression, risk of preterm birth, can also be impacted by wildfire. I like this next slide a little bit better to kind of break things down. And I know it looks a little busy, but we'll walk through it together. So this exposure to wildfire smoke, you can see down here, we have an increase, we have decrease, and then altered function as kind of our guide to assess this particular screen. Um, and with the lung, there is a brain axis that goes with that, as well as the vagus nerve innervates through the lungs as well. And this can impact, again, some of those neuro disorders, anxiety, depression, exacerbate some of those already potentially pre-existing conditions and or may influence new onset. Again, huge amounts of oxidative stress and systemic inflammation as it relates to the lungs and respiratory diseases that we see as a part of that. But there's also kind of that stress can also kind of bidirectionally impact, cardiovascular function, gut function. Again, we mentioned that skin exposure can impact circulation. So there's a lot of kind of the body isn't just one specific silo that gets impacted in one specific area. Often there's multiple systems that are working to mitigate an exposure that we have specifically as it relates to wildfire smoke. Um, on the circulatory side of the house, I mentioned this earlier, we might see changes in that heart rate variability. You might see increases in that resting heart rate or blood pressure. More like kind of longer term issues that we would look at is the like dyslipidemia, endothelial inflammation. So how inflamed that lining of our arteries is, plaque aggregation within those vasculature as well. I think that's probably been talked about a bit within fire, that you already know that there's an increase in cardiovascular disease risk just within firefighting. Same and increased risk that we see with wildfire smoke exposure. Within the gut, there's some interesting things that happen. And one of the biggest ones that I think is maybe not talked about as much, or I certainly didn't think about as much in the context of how long you're in really high heat, and what that does to intestinal permeability and intestinal inflammation and changes of the microbiome. And things that maybe in the short term you feel impacts of as you're eating MREs and you're just kind of like making things work. But in the longer run, you may see some longer term effects of that as well. And then I mentioned the preterm birth, but there is impacts on reproductive health just generally. We see egg viability go down, sperm number and viability go down, changes in reproductive function, and embryo development, which again would impact that fetal development as well. All right, so looking at some of the heavy metal exposure impacts, I went through a few of these here that are more common to see throughout the career. Um, Kind of again, similar to the wildfire smoke exposure, there's exposures kind of across the body that we can see with this. And I brought this in not only because there's heavy metals within smoke exposure, and obviously we want to be aware of that, but also, if you have any recreational activities that you like to do, like going to a shooting range, you might get higher exposure to some of these. If you've had a history of military service, you may already have inherent higher exposure to some of these things. And so we want to make sure that we're aware of that and then supporting the body as best as we can to mitigate. So a lot of the things that happen within why these disorders happen because of DNA damage. a ton of oxidative stress where we have little free radicals that go around and damage cells. We have increased inflammatory cytokines, which can cause their own damage as the body's trying to manage this big exposure. Kind of practically speaking, this is I brought over from some of my military presentations that I've done historically with regard to heavy metal exposure. But you can sometimes see some physical findings within this. This blue line on the teeth. We can see some Mies lines on the fingernails, graying of the hair, not always just a heavy metal exposure, certainly not. Obviously, that comes with aging, but kind of premature graying, that's one thing that we look at in the context of other things that can happen. And obviously, heavy metal exposure, as iterated on that previous slide, can impact so many different functions within the body. So cognitive function for sure, mood function, inflammation within the lung and the skins, as we had mentioned prior. Adverse food reactions can sometimes happen, and multiple chemical sensitivities can happen, meaning something maybe that you weren't sensitive before, whether it be food or like a detergent or a shampoo or whatever it might be, um, can start to crop up after some of these more chronic or acute exposures. More chronically, things like obesity, metabolic syndrome, atherosclerosis, those would be things that we would see kind of in the longer term development of heavy metal exposure, yes, but also like smoke inhalation and exposure as well. Um, Endocrine disruption, so looking at thyroid function, hormonal imbalances. And I would say I didn't call this out in my end slides when I talk about biomarkers, but these are some of these things we can track as well. So obviously you do your yearly lab work, we can look at changes within any of these and obviously make more aggressive, quote unquote, aggressive lifestyle changes as we need to based off of what labs are looking like. So like didn't have cardiovascular disease before. We did our lipids this year. Lipids are looking way worse. Okay, like we can do lifestyle things to help manage some of those things to see if we can bring it back down. Same thing with thyroid health, looking at, okay, what did my previous numbers look like and what do they look like kind of post some of these higher exposures. So let's get into the fun stuff of what we actually can do about all of this, because I think it's all well and good. Like, let's understand our why. But then let's really dive into what can we do to mitigate our risk. And not only now, like post exposure, but in any future exposures as well. Um, while I was still working in the military setting, we kind of framed this under the idea of personal protective nutrition, personal protective lifestyle. I think you're all familiar with personal protective equipment. So this is kind of in that same vein, or what are we doing consistently within our life to make sure that we have a robust and resilient body that can handle exposures, biotransform, eliminate, mitigate effectively, and keep our body going so that we don't have some of these more large detrimental side effects of cumulative exposure. And we'll go through a lot of these in more detail. But on the personal protective nutrition side of the house, looking at whole food, kind of plant forward, how many antioxidants are we getting, and anti-inflammatory compounds? Do we have high quality protein and fiber coming in the right amounts? Um, and especially kind of this is what I counsel on generally when I'm working one-on-one with folks in this whole food plant forward realm is that 80/20. 80% of the time, can I actually see and understand the food that's in front of me? Um, or if I look at a label, can I read all the ingredients that are on a particular label? Or is there a large amount of items that are more highly processed, a ton of packaged food or fast food items? And not to say that those can't fit, they certainly can, but when we start to not be able to recognize a lot of the ingredients on the label, more than we can see the real whole food, that's when things become problematic on that risk of longer term disease, longer term inflammation, higher stress, higher anxiety, higher depression rates. Um, when we don't have that, base of real whole food or that foundation of real whole food to lean back on. We also want to make sure our nutrition is working for us on building up a strong and robust microbiome. That is kind of one of our biggest defenses that our body helps to mitigate exposure from food and from our environment. And if that's not robust and supported, and we have that increased permeability or that in colloquially you hear this talk about as leaky gut, but in the medical setting, we call it increased intestinal permeability. If that's happening, things that the gut's supposed to be blocking can get back into circulation, and the body says, no, thank you. Let's send an immune response to that. So we want a good and robust microbiome. We want to make sure we're well hydrated. I think this is one that gets harped on all the time within fire. Um, and that's because there's good data to support that firefighters show up to trainings dehydrated, I think to the tune of over 80%. But even within like a wildfire situation, access to clean and fresh water and your ability to get to it and all of that can get compromised in some of those situations. And we have to recognize too that dehydration can play a role then in how hard the heart has to work and our risk of other inflammatory cascades that happen with that. And then we have environment and threat specific mitigations that we do on that personal protective nutrition. And that's where I'm going to spend the bulk of the rest of this presentation today is we had this wildfire smoke exposure. You have wildfire smoke exposure within the job and within the state that you live and in the states that we support. What do we do about them now? What do we do about them making sure you're taken care of in the future? I don't want to neglect, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because since this is a nutrition presentation, but I don't want to neglect that personal protective lifestyle as well. As that, excuse me, as that has a huge impact on how resilient the body is to a stressor. So looking at our sleep, what does your stress management look like? And going back to sleep, if we're sleeping chronically less than 7 hours a night, I know that shift work in and of itself comes with sleep disruptions. Are we still scrolling before bedtime, or are we kind of dialing in those sleep hygiene habits? On the nutrition side, on that sleep, are we trialing, some tart cherry juice and Greek yogurt and potentially some magnesium in that hour and a half to 2 hours prior to bedtime? That's kind of my favorite sleep cocktail is that, 4 to 6 ounces of tart cherry, about 20 to 25 grams of protein, and 200 milligrams of mag glycinate to really help support sleep. On the stress side of the house, do we have good stress management? Probably inherently with wildfire fighting alone. Um, I'd venture to guess there's higher stress just generally in some of those instances. And what are we doing to help mitigate that? Do we have practices that we utilize like diaphragmatic breathing or yoga or meditation or journaling to help manage that? In the nutrition space, I'm a huge fan of adaptogens on that stress side of the house. So things like ashwagandha and rhodiola to help manage that stress response more effectively within the body. I specifically mentioned those two as those have third-party verified versions of them, so higher quality on the supplemental side of the house. And ashwagandha right around 500 milligrams a day. Rhodiola, I usually start people right around 200. Ashwagandha, I like at night for stress, rhodiola during the day, but looking at am I doing stuff to support that stress response and coming back to baseline. Exercise obviously is one that can be highly protective, especially when done with appropriate periodization, appropriate deloads, making sure the nervous system has time to adjust as well. Connection. So this is, what are those personal relationships looking like? Time in nature. Do we have time to help reset that circadian rhythm? Do we have time to I like somewhat laugh that in the research now they call it like forest bathing, but that impact on the nervous system that actually can be had by spending time in nature. And I know this one's challenging too when there's high smoke levels or high pollutant levels within the air. It makes it difficult sometimes to get that time in nature that you want to get. And then what are we doing to build up that resilient mindset? So instead of like poor me, or this is all just kind of like a losing battle or anything like that, is no, what there are plenty of things that we can do. What can I do to help support my system and support my body so that I can do my job most effectively? So let's dive in on that nutrition, personal protective nutrition side of the house. Um, this is fortunately, a lot of more of the boring kind of small things that I would recommend for everybody to build that strong and robust body, but become highly important when we have more environmental exposures that you get exposed to through work. So looking at protein, looking at that zero point 0.8 to 1 gram per pound a day. If you have no clue where you're at, this is a good one just to kind of do a check-in. I'm not a huge fan of tracking long term, but you can track for a day or two and just learn where you're at. Maybe you're really close to this. Maybe you're quite a bit off, and that can be something that you can work towards. This is hugely helpful for maintenance of lean muscle tissue, which obviously can help on the performance side of the house when we have varied calorie intakes, especially, if it is MREs and you're doing a huge wildfire fighting has a huge calorie demand, huge calorie demand. So it can be hard to eat enough in the immediacy while you're actually doing the wildfire fighting or wildland work. But looking at the back end of how supported was I going into that from a lean muscle perspective. You'll hear me talk about it over and over and over again on the fiber, not only for cardiovascular risk reduction and diabetes support, gut microbiome support, but again, building up that strong and robust body, 40 grams plus per day. This is again one where if you track, I think a lot of times people are surprised about where they're actually at. Most folks I work with are right around, or I shouldn't say most folks, Americans generally are right around 15 grams a day of fiber, 15, 1 5. So I've got some work. Vegans and vegetarians tend to get upwards of 80 to 100 grams a day. So it's definitely doable when we prioritize about 2/3 of the plate coming from plant foods, because that's where our fiber comes from. And that's not just a ton of pasta or rice or whatever it might be. That's fruits, that's vegetables, that's seeds, that's nuts, that's starches like potatoes and squash. So thinking about how do we build up our plate to support that. And that really tracks along with that performance plate as well, like modifying the amount of starchy carbs specifically based off of your training volume. But looking at about 2/3 again of that plate coming from plants. So on lighter training days, that might be more vegetables. On higher training days, that might mean more starches like the potatoes, rice, and whole grains. Looking for at least two colors at each meal, that goes back to that personal protective nutrition, the antioxidants and anti-inflammatory nutrition. Um, Plays a huge role. Our fruits and vegetables, their varied colors, contain a lot of compounds called polyphenols and flavonoids and different antioxidants that help calm down inflammation. And I know that's not like the beautiful, jazzy, like bajillion supplements that you can take, but our body reads food best. It's called the synergistic effect of food. And so when we can prioritize that variety of color within each meal, that mitigates long-term disease risk through the mechanism of calming down inflammation within the body. And again, from those first slides, you could tell a lot of the kind of through line of all of that is the body's dealing with mass inflammatory processes. What is it doing to help calm those down? And our nutrition can either help that by calming it down, or hinder that by causing more inflammation. Think like highly processed food items, a ton of fast food, and stuff like that. Going back to that well-hydrated body as well, at least half of your body weight in ounces of fluid a day. When you're actually doing live burn work, that is way higher, closer to 1 to 1 of your body weight in ounces of fluid a day. And some of you may have heard that stat on about 40 ounces of fluid can be lost per hour when doing firework, live burn work, wildfire work, within your gear through sweat losses, and that's over a Nalgene worth of sweat per hour. So when we look at rehydration post, typically we try to look at about 16 to 20 ounces of fluid per body weight of pound that was lost in sweat. So that would be quite a bit of fluid if we're losing 40 ounces. You're looking at closer to um, 40 ounces would be like 2 to 3 pounds. I'm doing my fast math here. Um, 48 ounces is about 3 pounds. So that would be, again, that like 20 times 3 is right around 60 ounces of fluid then to replace what was lost in just 1 hour. So it becomes a huge effort when we're undergoing big wildland work and live burn work just generally. But if you're sticking at least that 1 to 1 of body weight in ounces of fluid a day, meaning if you weigh 180 pounds, about 180 ounces of fluid, then at least we're starting from a good baseline. And I purposely say fluid here and not water, because in these huge exposures with high sweat losses, electrolytes are going to be hugely helpful on rehydrating more quickly, and specifically electrolytes that have some carbohydrate with them. So your higher sodium formulas like Drip Drop and Liquid IV and Fluid ORS all have that higher sodium with a little bit of carbohydrate that help bring that into the cell more quickly. And down here, if you go back to that PPN slide and look back, you saw the microbiome supported diet or nutrition. And the way I practically really like to do that is twofold right here. That fiber is what feeds the good bacteria within our gut, and then increasing our fermented food intake. So as little as 2 tablespoons of sauerkraut can get you about 10 billion CFUs of probiotic. So don't necessarily have to go toward a supplement, but I really like sticking with food for that because the gut likes diversity. It likes diversity of strains of bacteria. And when we're constantly pummeling the same ones from a probiotic, we don't have as much diversity as I like to see. And that doesn't mean they don't have short-term utilization and or case by case utilization, but that's kind of my general rule of thumb is let's try and get it from food where we can. Um, One note I'll say on this is if we have a highly disrupted gut, that you're dealing with IBS issues, you have a lot of food sensitivities, whatever it might be, and you're not entirely sure what's going on, there are some gut bacteria that can grow within the gut that can make you feel worse when you have fermented food, meaning when you have like a that dose of sauerkraut, it feels worse, like more bloated, more gassy, whatever it might be. Um, and so just note that that can happen if we have kind of dysbiosis or non-beneficial gut bacteria growing within the gut. And that is something I would work one-on-one with a provider to figure out. I called out the performance plate again because that 2/3 of the plate coming from plants, I really wanted to show you the visual. This is not a performance nutrition lecture by any means, but if you've heard me talk before or heard a performance nutrition lecture before, you've probably seen something similar to this, where 2/3 of the plate are coming from plants, regardless of what type of training day it is. It just might differ on the type. So we see more vegetables on our lighter training days, um, more when we have that moderate training, that 60 to 90 minutes, and then going into that harder training. When you're doing actual wildland firefighting, you are here. Every meal is here within the hard, where the bulk should be coming from starchy carbs because your volume of work is so incredibly high. If you are eating far too low carbohydrate, that in and of itself causes inflammation. And so we don't want to compound that through nutrition if we don't have to. So making sure we're eating enough to support our training volume and what we're asking the body to do from a physical demand. But again, that visual of that 2/3 of the plate coming from um, our plant foods. And going back to the that fiber comment of 40 grams a day, I think sometimes people are like, cool, how do I do that? If I'm at 15, how do I get to 40? And that feels like a really, really daunting task to do. So I put here the dietitian who made this chart is called the geriatric dietitian. So shout out to her. Um, but I liked how this chart broke everything down. So looking at our fruits, blackberries tend to be quite high in 1 cup serving about 8. Wild caught blueberries, if you look in the freezer section, there's wild caught blueberries that are closer to 7. An avocado can be about 5. A large avocado, if you eat the entire thing, can be about 10. Chia seeds in 2.5 tablespoons, we can get 9. So that doesn't add like a ton of bulk to the actual food that you have to eat. Like you could easily mix that into a yogurt, um, or into like an oatmeal or something to get a boost of fiber there. Grains you'll see are not crazy high on that list. So I think a lot of times people think, oh, I got to eat oatmeal. But oats only provide about 4, which isn't 0, but there are a lot of our plant foods up here from fruits and vegetables that provide a ton more. And legumes are a huge, huge hitter as well. So incorporating those can be highly beneficial to support the microbiome and support that um, calming down that inflammation within the gut. And then again, our vegetables up here, some things like pumpkin, peas, Brussels sprouts, broccoli are going to be some of your heavier hitters from the vegetable side of the house on your fiber. So once you do your own inventory, see where you're at, come back to this slide and start to plug and play. Maybe I do a yogurt in the morning and I typically don't add a ton of things to it, but maybe I could add 1/2 cup of blackberries and even 2 tablespoons of chia seeds. And all of a sudden, now I have 10 extra grams of fiber in that yogurt that I've been doing in the morning without a ton of extra calories and without of a ton of extra volume. So knowing where you're at is kind of the first step on that. I'll come back to fiber as well, because you'll see it again listed later on, but having our bowels move appropriately is a huge part of that detox process that the body goes through. So let's go into the deep dive on this environment and threat specific as it relates to wildfire. So again, I mentioned we want to do that immediate recovery. What are we doing to mitigate and support long-term impact? And how do we support going forward, knowing that we might get exposed again? And I think that because each individual has a different career, each individual has a different health history, each individual has a different dietary pattern, they're coming in with an exercise pattern and stress, that I like to look at this in an individual risk stratification. And I kind of break it down like this. So, what is our current burden? And we'll go through each one of these individually. What's our current burden? What's our exposure at work and at home? And how can I evaluate my own susceptibility? So, is my body going to be more susceptible to some of the damaging impacts of that wildfire smoke exposure? Or are there things I can do to help build up my PPN, my personal protective nutrition, and my PPL, my lifestyle, to make sure I'm reducing my susceptibility to some of those larger impacts? So, let's dive into the current burden. This is a really busy slide, and I apologize for that. But I personally, when I'm working one-on-one with somebody, I like to start with what's called a My Symptom questionnaire. Sometimes this will get utilized in like the functional medicine or nutrition space. This is not a wildfire specific inventory, but this is an inventory I do to see where are our biggest pain points from a symptomology standpoint. So, are we dealing with a ton of respiratory issues? Are we dealing with some of those lines or spots on the nails? Are we dealing with garbage energy issues and sleep? Do we have a ton of neurological things going on or GI issues? And then I can total these and see kind of what that symptom burden is. So that's my personal way that I like to start to assess, like, what does your current symptom burden look like? Whether that's, prior to a future exposure or immediately after an exposure. And where do those exposures come from? I feel a little annoying for how often I've even said exposures thus far in this presentation. But they come from a lot of different sources, especially within the firefighting realm. I don't think there's any surprise over some of these uh, infographics that you've likely probably seen. But firefighting just generally is classified as a group one carcinogen. So we want to be cognizant of that and looking at how do we reduce again, um, reduce exposure where we can, but also mitigate as best as we can as well. And I wanted to call out this info over here. Sources of some of these endocrine disruptors as well. And that's looking at some of like the PFAS things that can come from the gear, the water, BPA, obviously more popularized, some of them like the canned foods. Dioxins are also present within wildfire smoke and in air pollutants as well, flame retardants. Phthalates, this would be things like phthalates and parabens that you might get exposed to at home. Um, and this is interestingly like the phthalates and the parabens exposure. This study was actually done on women firefighters, but their exposures to phthalates and parabens were higher at home than they were at work due to some of the cleaning products or cookware or microwaving in plastic than they were at work. And so I think that that's just such an interesting stat to think about. And what is my own at-home exposure? And I think this world can get a little bit swirly twirly on like, is everything poison? And instead of going that down that rabbit hole, saying, what can I do that's small in my own home today or tomorrow? For me personally, that was not microwaving in plastic. So getting glass cook or glass storageware for my leftovers. That was important for me and for my family. And a couple years after that, when we were able to afford new cookware, that's what we did for our cookware. And then a couple years after that, I figured out, detergents and soaps and cleaning supplies. So it doesn't have to be an immediate overhaul of everything in your existence, but just being cognizant of how frequently do I have these things coming into my environment? And this gets compounded within like high intake of convenient and fast food items. Obviously, a lot of things that are wrapped in plastic will increase some of those exposures as well. And as it relates to some like pesticide exposures, I always encourage, regardless of organic or non-organic, both which have their own pesticides on them, washing your fruits and vegetables. You can Google how to best wash my fruits and vegetables. It's a little bit of vinegar, a little bit of water. Sometimes people will put in a couple of drops of unscented Dawn, and that can eliminate that residue on top of our fresh fruits and vegetables as well. Phytoestrogens is included on here, things like soy. I get less concerned about that unless we have like a known sensitivity, as it takes a boatload of exposure to that to have any sort of endocrine impact. And in fact, a lot of like edamame and tofu and things like that can be actually highly beneficial from a long-term cancer risk reduction standpoint. Um, so then going into susceptibility. Um, so looking at, do I have a history of known occupational exposures? You're a firefighter, so check, yes, I do. This also might be double checked if you have a history of military service, that you have higher occupational exposures, not only from firefighting, but maybe from that world as well. We went over those lifestyle exposures that can maybe happen in the home. Chemical sensitivity, I mentioned that do we notice extra sensitivity to, certain lotions or detergents, cleaning supplies, certain foods that maybe you had or had not had before? Do we have new onset of autoimmune issues? This is the body's lack of response on an immune process that we would anticipate to happen. And the docs that I work with, they call this loss of tolerance. So the immune system is not as tolerant. And thereby we have a lack of an immune response and an increased risk of some of these autoimmune issues that can crop up. More common that you hear on this front is things like thyroid issues like Hashimoto's, lupus, RA, some of these other autoimmune issues. What is our nutrient status? So do we have deficiencies? Are we deficient in vitamin D? Are we getting in a wide variety of fruits and vegetables? Do I take a multivitamin? Do I take a high quality multivitamin? Maybe is a better comment. But looking at my nutrient status and saying, like, are there areas where I'm deficient? And this could also be not eating enough. Am I eating enough calories to support my training volume? Am I too low on protein? Am I too low on fiber? Or do I have any issues with maldigestion or malabsorption, constipation? This would be more of those GI issues I was mentioning earlier, things like IBS, gluten intolerance, chronic constipation or diarrhea. I would always encourage that to get looked at more thoroughly. Celiac disease, all of those things can impact your digestion, your absorption of those nutrients, and can increase that susceptibility of the body once we have these big exposures to have more severe downstream effects. So in looking at that individual risk, again, kind of like putting it all together, looking at that total exposure and what do we already have body stores of? So theoretically, like, do we have heavy metal stores that the body already has been exposed to from previous work or from, again, those recreational activities, this immediate exposure? And then what is our body's ability to biotransform that? So take whatever negative thing we don't want in the body, how do we transform it and get rid of it? And that's what we're going to end with today, is figuring out how do we transform and get rid of some of those more toxic things that we do get exposed to. But this whole equation here, so our exposure plus our stores minus how well we're able to get all of those things out, is considered what the body's toxic burden is. So these are fancy terms, and I apologize for those not wanting a science lesson today. I am purely showing you this slide to give you a why. Why do we want to care about our liver, and why do we want to be so nice to it? Is because it does the lion's share of the work on transforming these negative compounds that the body gets exposed to from life and from wildland smoke exposure. And then that elimination process is that stool. How do we get it out? Bile, stool, urine, get that out. So phase 1 and phase 2 detox happen within the body to transform those negative exposures. And then that GI system and those kidneys get it out. These processes within the liver have a lot of nutrition-related nutrients that are needed to help effectively function and upregulate their processes. So if I want to upregulate oxidation of some of these things I'm getting exposed to, I know I need to have really good quality B vitamins coming in through the diet and or potentially on supplemental support. Again, I'll go back to, I always want to aim for food first on a lot of these things. There are some that can be supported from a supplemental side of the house. But I'm cautious about that. Things like glutathione, when it's supplemented directly, or even like I know potentially people are getting like ad targeted with some IV therapy options. Glutathione, when provided just straight up by itself, is not as effectively utilized within the liver as its precursor, which is called NAC, N-acetylcysteine. And you'll see that listed over here. But that's a precursor to glutathione. And so that's one that can better help upregulate glutathione within the liver. And that particular example that I gave you is the body's most powerful antioxidant. So again, thinking about how can we support that through diet and strategic supplementation. And I'll comment on this here because I didn't put a slide in on it, but thinking about things that also challenge the liver. So if we're taking a huge amount of supplements and we're not entirely certain of why we're taking everything, the liver has to deal with those things. So that's an increased demand on the liver. Some of those things can be supportive for the liver, but I really like to be cognizant of a good assessment of how many things we're taking in. And not shockingly, alcohol is obviously a huge hindrance on liver function. If you already have pre-existing conditions like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, this would be an area that we'd really, really want to focus on for you to make sure that that liver can get supported effectively so it can do its job to get rid of the things that you get exposed to in a wildfire smoke exposure. So again, reduction of alcohol is only helpful, is not only helpful for liver health, but hugely helpful in also reducing inflammation across the body, as that is also a known carcinogen. All right. So threat specific, what do we do to help build up this nutritional resiliency? And I know some of these things have fancy words on them, but we're going to break it down together. So what I look at as the primary goals is how do we support the liver? How do we support its ability to transform all those things it needs to? How do we support getting things out? So that GI system, and we'll go through a little bit on sweat as well and reducing that oxidative stress and inflammation throughout the whole body. So how do we calm down some of that massive inflammation that comes in? Supporting that transformation process, I mentioned glutathione earlier as that powerhouse antioxidant, can help neutralize some of the toxins we get exposed to. That's hugely helpful across the body, but also in the liver. And some of the foods that can help do this are things like avocado, broccoli, spinach, garlic, eggs, salmon, that contain these glutathione precursors. And as I mentioned on that previous slide, this NAC or N-acetylcysteine can boost glutathione production. So there's a few companies that have good versions of NAC. Thorne, now Pure Encapsulations have good versions of NAC. And again, I prefer that to straight up glutathione supplementation as it more effectively boosts the production than straight up glutathione does when you supplement that directly. If you remember, those B vitamins were both in phase 1 and phase 2, hugely important for detox within the liver, also hugely important for managing the stress response within the body. So those get cached a ton. We get a lot of B vitamins from things like your whole grains, eggs, organ meats are a big source of B vitamins as well. This is one that because there tends to be such a high demand in a more stressed population that I recommend just a straight up multivitamin that essentially has a B complex within it so that you're not taking multiple different supplements. You can straight up take a B complex if you desire, but I instead like to go toward a multivitamin that has higher B vitamins within it and that can support these processes. So the two third-party verified versions that I like are either the Momentous or Thorne multivitamin that have a higher B complex within them. And that think about that as kind of like a insurance policy, which is exactly what supplements are supposed to do. Supplement where we're not getting adequate intake from the diet. And again, a multi can be helpful here on just hitting those bases where we might not have adequate intake. Sulfur-rich foods are really, really helpful for phase 2 detox enzymes, things like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. Broccoli sprouts are a big one that I will have people like kind of toss into salads or throw on top of eggs. Since you guys are in California, oftentimes you can get those at a lot of farmers markets. Here in Colorado, those are not super in season right now, but a great one that you can get at farmers markets as well. And things like onion and garlic can be really, really helpful in upregulating those phase 2 enzymes that help transform what we want to transform within the liver and then send it over to the gut to get out. And then antioxidant foods, vitamin C and E, those are also a part of the processes in phase 1 and phase 2 to support those enzymatic functions to get things out. Things like your citrus fruits, lemon, lime, oranges, dark berries, think blackberries, blueberries, cranberries, nuts and seeds are going to be high in that vitamin E, and high polyphenol foods, things like green tea. Sorry, there shouldn't be a comment there. Green tea, matcha, some of our foods that will contain those higher polyphenol compounds. All right, so this was the transform. This is the liver portion. This is the how do we get it out? How do we support kidney function? How do we support gut function? How do we get, once the body can manage the transformation of those things, how do we get them out of the system? Staying hydrated. I mentioned this earlier, closer to 1 to 1 of your body weight in fluid when you're training. Some things like dandelion tea or green tea might have a mild diuretic effect on the body. So helping again, peeing frequently, not peeing a regular amount. So if you've gone really long periods of time without peeing, your pee is really, really dark. We need some kidney support to make sure that we're getting that fluid in appropriately and making sure the system can stay hydrated. Looking at stool excretion. So how are we getting things bound with bile and then excreted through the stool? A huge portion of this is fiber. I mentioned it earlier. I'm going to mention it again because this is what adds bulk to the stool and helps get things out. Again, track where you're at and see so we can then adjust accordingly. If you're at 15, tomorrow you don't need to be at 40. Slowly stepwise yourself up so your gut can adjust and so you don't get crazy constipated. I think people immediately also think of fiber supplements. And I tend to like to do again food first and see where we're at. Things like psyllium husk can be utilized as a soluble fiber option. You'll get about 5 to 7 grams per serving. So again, when we look at 40, that still means the bulk needs to be coming in through diet. Probiotics and fermented foods, I mentioned this before when it related to the personal protective nutrition. It shows up here again in supporting that good microbiome, that good barrier function so that things don't leak through that aren't supposed to. And again, helping good transit time. Bile flow boosters, this is the connection between the liver and the gut, is that bile that helps bind to some of these toxins that we want to get out and cue that appropriate release, which can also help with digestion. Things like our bitter greens, so things like arugula, dandelion greens can help cue bile release. Interestingly, as an aside, this is one thing that we utilize if people have gallbladder removal. When we're trying to retrain, when fat comes back into the diet, we have them eat it with some more of these bitter foods. So the body's saying, hey, like be ready for some fattier foods to come in. We need to release some bile. Healthy fats can also help with this. Things like olive oil, walnuts, avocado oil can all be really helpful. I put a section in here on sweat and skin, and I put a huge asterisk here because this is all well and good to eliminate through skin, through things like exercise and sauna therapy, but there have to be very, very good practices on who cleans this sauna, or are you showering immediately after exercise? Because otherwise things are getting reabsorbed. So those who are like crushing sauna therapies, great. With that asterisk, we want to make sure we're being safe. But we also want to make sure that you're washing off and that that sauna has actually been cleaned so that you're just not getting constantly re-exposed to these toxins we're aiming to eliminate through sweat. So again, showering as soon as you can immediately after exercise and sauna therapy, especially after these higher exposures. Some things like dry brushing and Epsom salt baths can support some lymphatic drainage as well. Again, not the focus of this presentation as we're focusing on the nutrition side, but wanted to bring those in as they do play a role. And I think sauna therapy is like hugely popular, and I just hold so much caution of me, like where is this sauna and who is cleaning it, and do you know that it's clean? Are the questions that I want to know. Because I've harped on it so much, I want you to know, how are your bowels? Are you pooping at least 1 to 3 times per day or more than that, less than that? Do you have any straining, pain, or bloating? Are your stools loose or formed? You can always go over here to this chart. We like to see really that type 4, the long, smooth logs is what we aim for. This is phase 3 detox. So phase 1 and 2 happen within the liver. Phase 3 is getting it out. So I can't emphasize enough that we want good bowel support. If it is off, you can work with a provider to support that, test different things. I have said this before in fire and all my other communities that I work in. Just because it's common does not mean it is normal within bowel health. So just because everybody has explosive bowels doesn't mean that that's a normal thing. Finally, here on reducing that oxidative stress, not surprisingly, our big antioxidant vitamins play a role within that. C and E are big powerhouses of antioxidant vitamins. A plays a role within that as well. From a food compound, turmeric, the yellow spice that's utilized in a lot of cooking, has a bioactive compound within it called curcumin. And that is a really, really potent anti-inflammatory. It can support liver and lung health. It's one I recommend a ton for some chronic joint pain as well. Because again, just really potent anti-inflammatory. 500 milligrams a day of curcumin is what I recommend. 1 to 2 times a day, morning and night. I don't like this particular compound being taken right after training because it is a potent anti-inflammatory and we want some beneficial inflammation from training. So if you're going to take a curcumin supplement, I would obviously talk to a credentialed provider and decide if that's appropriate for you. But morning and night is what I look at. Resveratrol is one I don't do so much through supplement, but really looking at food intake of that. Um, Omega-3s, we can get some of this through foods, but this is one that, especially from like the fatty fish side of the house, salmon, you'll get about a gram and about 3.5 to 4 ounces of salmon, of your omega-3s. I like to see 2 to 3 grams a day, and that is too much fish with regard to mercury exposure. So it's hard to eat that much fish without getting more mercury exposed. So this is one I actually supplement quite a bit. Totally great to increase food intake, as you've heard me say salmon previously for glutathione precursor. You heard me say walnuts for bile support. We heard me say flaxseed and chia seeds for fiber. So obviously they play roles outside of their omega-3 provision. But when we look at omega-3 specifically as its anti-inflammatory function within the brain and within the joints and the arterial walls and within the gut, I like to look at supplementation for that. And I like to look at a triglyceride form, which you don't necessarily need to care about. These are the companies that do that. Nordic Naturals, Momentous, and Thornall have a triglyceride form of their omega-3. And again, looking at that 2 to 3 grams. And I like to see about a gram of EPA and about a gram of DHA for that omega-3. And then I've mentioned this a few times throughout, but reducing some of those things that can cause more inflammation from the food system. So if we have that 80-20, if 80% of the time our food is coming from highly processed food or fast food, or we're kind of just eating on the go perpetually, we have a ton of alcohol coming in, that is something we can work on. Tomorrow doesn't need to be, the flip-flop of like 80% is all real whole food. Not necessarily. Like we can work on that to stepwise and make sure it's fitting into your life and making sure it's a sustainable change. But if you're caught in that loop of that highly processed food, fast food, I'm too busy, I can't do it. I would encourage you to work with somebody one-on-one to figure out some strategies you can figure out to help reduce that and increase those real whole foods that play such a role within the body as a whole. All right, I did want to put a slide in on some nutrient support for lungs. NAC shows up here again, and I put the dosing here for NAC. I mentioned these same brands earlier of good versions, but it can help break down some mucus and support lung function. Quercetin naturally occurs within onions and apples and capers and can help reduce airway inflammation. Ginger and turmeric, I mentioned turmeric in the last slide, but even things like ginger turmeric tea, like I've shown over here, can help clear some lung mucus and reduce inflammation. Emollient tea, you'll sometimes see this in like singers and like the throat coat teas. Sometimes you'll see the emollient, and that can help soothe aggravated airways as well. I wanted to put a couple of notes here on the targeting that's happening for the wildfire smoke exposure in LA. Um, this is something I'm talking about just generally in a lot of my presentations because it's getting pumped on social media. This formula is getting a lot of action on the algorithms, meaning like it gets shown on a lot of people's feeds when they hold this particular type of algorithm. So they share some aspect of influencer shares some aspect of food system or environment, which I am for us understanding. Obviously, that was a huge portion of this presentation. There's this encouragement that information is being withheld from you. So occasionally there's like some cherry picking of research to confirm some viewpoint. But my biggest kicker is what are they trying to sell you that is potentially benefiting that end person? So like whatever discount code or is there like a service or product that they're trying to sell you? I just want you to hold caution on this. It doesn't mean everybody that out there has nefarious intents, not by any means. I just want a critical eye approached with a lot of the stuff that gets pummeled on social media. And ask yourself who benefits the most from this particular model. Because again, in taking a ton of different supplements or non-regulated supplements, we expose ourselves to a lot of different things, which I'll show you. But I just did a quick search of like, what are people talking about? And here was a lot of the headlines that came up as it relates to the LA fires. I mentioned this, but a lot of the supplements that get pummeled on social media and just in the world in general aren't third-party verified. And I want you to be highly cognizant of that and highly critical of that because there's endocrine disruptors present in supplements. There's adulterations happening within sport supplements. There's heavy metals and toxicity happening within sport supplements and dietary supplements. So I want you to hold all the caution and remember those third-party verifications. If you need a website of some good information as it relates to supplement safety, OPSS is a wonderful one that exists through the Department of Defense. And you can even ask an expert. You don't have to be a member of the DoD to do that. And get information about different types of supplements. It's a huge resource. And here's a note on those third-party verifications. So again, if it does not have one of these, you do not know for sure what's in that supplement. It's way, way, way cheaper to not have these, and it's way, way, way cheaper to buy crappy ingredients and put them into supplements. I do not want your liver or your body to have to deal with crappy supplements. That is counterproductive to what we want to do to get you supported. So looking at third-party verification is going to be huge to make sure that you are getting high quality supplementation. You can even go directly to these websites to figure out different products that you're interested in. You can see the products that test for heavy metals. You can see how frequently they test. Some of these have apps you can look at. Beautiful. So much help. But this again is verifying is what's on that label is what is inside that bottle. All right. So a few other, I just wanted to leave you with some testing considerations. I put a huge reminder right here. Maybe I should have made this as big as this. Always, always, always with new supplements coming on board with any sort of like testing that you want to do with gut or heavy metals or anything like that, make sure you're working with a credentialed care provider to discuss your options, making sure it makes sense for you, making sure they understand your health history, making sure they understand what other medications you may be on, because that all needs to be taken into consideration with supplementation, with additional testing, all of those things. The lifestyle stuff I talked about, so the food, the fiber, the hydration, the adequate protein, the increasing plants, making sure your microbiome supported. Those are things lifestyle-wise that we can recommend regardless of what tests show. A lot of times I would even just be going back to those same very things. I'm just getting something confirmed through a test. Like you got exposed to wildfire smoke. You got exposed to heavy metals. It's manifesting within a lab test. I'm still going to do all the lifestyle stuff I previously mentioned in this presentation. So I don't want you to think that testing is necessary end all be all for everybody, but I do think this is an interesting thing of like the way forward to better understand exposures And this is a lot of stuff that people are doing research-wise, and you guys probably even know more on your occupational med of what people are tracking. And so I just wanted to put a few on here. Carbon monoxide exposure, fine particulate matter. There's no test for this, but occasionally lung function tests will be done to see its impact on breathing. In the research setting, there's being some testing done on these VOCs, and blood tests can be done for some of those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Again, even if these tests showed positive, I'd still go back to how do we support your liver? How do we support your lungs? How do we support your body, calming down inflammation and getting these things out? Heavy metals, same thing, can be tested in blood or urine. Dioxin testing can show a recent exposure, but it's less effective for long term. Some inflammatory markers. HSCRP is actually one I look at for like as a yearly test I do with a lot of folks that I work with to understand the inflammation within the body. It's nondescript, so it's like you have a high HSCRP. That means you have inflammation in your liver. It's nondescript. It's just throughout the entire body. So it could be inflammation all over the place. It's not pointed to one particular body area. This 8-OHDG is a urine test that can measure oxidative stress. And again, most of these are done either within the medical system with like a primary care provider or occupational med provider, and or in the research setting. So I can't sing it enough that you need to be working with qualified professionals on all of these things. I wanted to end with a huge thank you. I know that the job that you all have said yes to is often a calling and not the easiest job on earth. And I'm so, so humbled and grateful that you have chosen to do what you do. And I got told, in the military members, people oftentimes are going up and saying, thank you for your service. And I wish that happened more frequently for firefighters, as much as it does for military, because you're worth it. You're worth getting all of this information. You're worth having your body taken care of just as much as anyone. And you're doing so much in our communities. So I just wanted to end with a huge, huge thank you for everything you're doing. And the question and answer session will come at a later date. And thank you so much for listening on for this presentation, and so, so grateful for your time. Have a great rest of your day.